Hey YouTubers, I'm going to try a little bit of a Bible study through YouTube. We're going to start with John. So starting in First John 1 through 18. I'll read it real quick, just in case you don't have it, and then I'm going to talk briefly about my impression or my idea of this section. So, First John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him not anything made that was made. In him was life. That life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in the name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him, and cried out, "This was he whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So, First John is a really interesting beginning. It the whole gospel goes through and uses this term, the Word, and it talks about the light. And of all the gospels, it's the most unique. It's almost spiritualized, and some people avoid it because of that. But it's got a really neat flavor to it that I hope we can come to appreciate together. I want to talk a little bit about the term "the Word" that it uses. I think oftentimes we think in Christian circles we talk about it as if John was the first one to talk about the Word like that, and that there's really no other scripture about the Word. And there's certainly no scripture that talks about the Word becoming flesh, and that's not exactly true. So in Jesus' time, the scriptures that they would have had, so the scriptures that Jesus would have grown up on, the scriptures that John, the author of this book, would have grown up on, they were probably written in Aramaic, because they would have been written in the tongue of the locals, and the locals at that time would have spoken Aramaic. So they may have read from the Hebrew, particularly if they had a scholar there, but coming from the small towns that they did, it's more likely that the synagogues at the time weren't reading Hebrew, they were probably reading Aramaic. And the Aramaic scriptures, they were these interpretations, and they were called targums. And targums were translations of the Hebrew scriptures by a priest that they called, or a scribe that they called, targums. So they shared the same name. There might have been a different inflection, like Targum versus Targum, so I may be getting that part wrong, but essentially the names were really close between whether you're talking about the priest or the scribe that translates it and the actual translation itself. Each one was a little unique. They weren't all the same, and so if you look at one Targum and you compare it to another, they're not identical. There's a difference. There's a pretty big difference, because they're going to have their own inflections and their own ideas in there. But one of the things that's interesting that almost all of them from that time period share is they had this thing that in English would be this term that in English would be translated as the Word. And the way that they used it is any place in Scripture where God is listed talking to himself. So like at the beginning of creation, you've got God saying to God, "Let us go down." The plurals that you find in there, where there's these conversations back and forth that seem to be God talking to himself. Whenever that would happen, they would use the word for one of those. The other place that they would use it is anytime there was a physical manifestation. So the burning bush, the act of creation itself, because it was a physical act. So God that breathed into the nostrils of man, that was the Word. The Word breathed into his nostrils. So John didn't come up with this out of nowhere. It wasn't just a revelation that he received directly through his time with Christ. This is something that he grew up with. He grew up with this type of thinking, and it would have been read to him in the Targums. He would have been very familiar with who the Word was, and he would have been very familiar with the idea that the Word was also God, and that the Word was the Creator. And so it's interesting, and I don't want to say it takes out the spiritual of this, but it does add a new layer to it, and makes it a little bit more real when you hear John talk about the Word, and realize that when he's talking about the Word, he's not just talking about Jesus as we read in the New Testament. He's talking about this long Jewish history, this culture that has all of these stories with the Word already in it. And John is just making this beautiful connection that the Word in the Old Testament, the scriptures that he would have had at the time, is the same person as Jesus Christ. So it's right from the go, John has my attention with that, because it's this really cool highlight. But the whole thing's pretty neat. It goes in and it says really clearly that nothing was made without him, and very rarely do we think of Jesus as the creator. But what it's saying here is that Jesus was the creator, that he was there, and that nothing was made that he didn't have a part in. And so, sometimes in our heads we kind of separate the Godhead, and well, Jesus did these things and God did these things, but at least in this case, if there's a separation, if it's not just complete unity, it's Jesus was the physical manifestation that actually did the creating. It also talks about in him was life, and the life was a light to men, and there's this long history of light to men being truth. And I think we're probably going to come more into that as we talk more about these verses. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So this is just a great intro to the Gospel of John. He starts off, and he's going to move into John the Baptist, different than John, the author of the book of John. He's going to move into how John was trying to introduce Jesus, and what he was saying about him. But also, just the last thing I want to point out is in verse 114, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we've seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father." I hope as we read this that we get into what the gospel is and how John understood it, because I think it's different than we often share it with people. And it starts with this. It starts with this idea that God, the God that created everything, our God, emptied himself, poured himself out, poured out deity, and became flesh. And he became man. He became like us. And that's this beautiful part of the gospel that you just can't miss. And everything kind of hinges on that, at least the way I understand the gospel. So I hope as we continue that we'll have some good conversations around this. I welcome comments. I do realize that as I talk about some of this stuff that I'm likely to leave tradition, as you've heard it, orthodoxy, and I'm okay with that. And I'm okay that not everybody's going to be comfortable with where I go with some of it. But I hope I have something interesting to add to the conversation, and I ask that God will guide me and help me to stay within the bounds of what can edify him. So thanks for your time. I look forward to hearing from y'all.